Hello and welcome, my name is Dychronic, and today I'm taking a look at my top 10 PvP primaries in Destiny 2 Season of the Seraph. And of course, as always, this video is backed up by my spreadsheet with all the beautiful stuff that you know and love with all the new weapons. And that can still be found at my Discord server, link in the description down below on the channel, #SpreadsheetStocks. And it's your one-stop shop for a lot of the stuff you need to know about these weapons. And I know a lot of you guys are going to be skipping this part, but videos like this, and specifically the spreadsheets, would really not be possible without the support of my patrons. So if you want to see them continue, please consider checking it out. Link in the description down below. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. On screen right now is my spreadsheet and all of its beautiful dark theme, color-coded information, perk recommendations, catalyst information for a lot of the weapons in the game, and is essentially your one-stop shop for knowing which weapons are doing well in the Crucible. And real quick, just wanted to give a bit of an intro to a lot of new players who are arriving on the scene to explain how this spreadsheet works and why it's important. If you've seen this kind of stuff before, on screen is a timestamp, just skip to that. So first and foremost, the organization of this spreadsheet may seem a bit random, but I've grouped weapons together that are the most like each other. For example, the frame and RPMs are going to be right next to each other. So if you like a weapon, like for example Gnawing Hunger, you know that there are other weapons right next to it. They're going to be very similar to each other. And of course, beyond that, obviously ranked by different weapon types that are obviously clearly displayed. Beyond that, obviously I have my perk recommendations for a lot of the weapons. A lot of these will seem very similar to each other because a lot of these things I do pick the same stuff. And the listed items are going to be in order the ones that I like the best. Not specifically the best pairings, obviously you have to use a little bit of brain to figure out whether something works well together, but these are going to be my personal favorite on this weapon. And there are usually vastly more potential options. When it comes to the rankings, you'll see a lot of numbers. Maybe confused why I've not chosen one weapon for each spot, because honestly, there are a lot of weapons that are very similar to each other. For example, you'll see this whole section is all adaptive frame 140 hand cannons, and most of them are going to act very similar to each other. However, there are certain ones with better stat advantages or perks that I found to be better than the rest. And sometimes you'll even see a sub rank, for example B, A, or C, and these are again just going to be sub ranks within the same ranks. Usually most of these weapons will act very similar to each other, but I did want to discern which ones are performing better than others. And almost always in every category I'm going to have at least one best in class that's highlighted in purple, or it'll say BIC, and an honorable mention to one of the legendaries, just so you know my favorite legendaries are. And of course throughout this video I'll be showing more of this spreadsheet on screen, but for the most part you can also see the spreadsheet yourself and choose the weapons that you want to go after. Keeping in mind, some of these weapons will be a lot harder to get than other ones, and of course I don't go through just the top 10. Instead, I go through each category of weapons and talk about how the weapon class fits in the meta, and of course the best archetype within each class. This will help you understand much more about the meta, and even recommend stuff that may not even be in the top 10. In the first major category, we have the auto rifles. And although they're not majorly ranked, and technically they haven't been for quite some time, I wouldn't say that they're a bad weapon type. Especially if you're new to the game, auto rifles make a lot of sense. And frankly, something like the adaptive frames will be very controllable and have really good stats, and it'll be a great introduction. Although generally, I also recommend pulse rifles, and we'll talk about that later on. The one big downside to auto rifles, other than their time to kill not being super competitive, is their inability to peak shoot. They cannot maintain their DPS and time to kill output while going in and out of cover. Something like a hand cannon, or a scout rifle, or even some low fire rate pulse rifles can go in and out of cover, making you much less vulnerable and do a lot more damage. That being said, my personal favorite when it comes to auto rifles are going to be the adaptive frames. Great middle zone of all the different stats, handling, stability, range, perk options, availability. I personally recommend them. Although again, a big fan favorite is going to be the rapid fires. For example, Chroma Rush we do see from the Zura bunch, and of course crate drops from World Drop. I also wanted to just touch base real quick on the only fusion rifle and grenade launcher. First up we have Vex Mythic class, which is honestly very close to being in the top 10. Very good aim assistance, has the extra linear shot, and also obviously has a faster fire rate than 360 auto rifles while doing the same damage. So it's still an excellent option, just didn't make the top 10. For the only primary ammo grenade launcher, we have Fighting Lion, and most of the time you're going to be using this in a wombo combo with a bow or a hand cannon, and that means that you're not going to be using a special weapon. And a lot of times those special weapons will be insta-kill options, which will often be preferred. After that, let's talk about the bows. And again, bows are not a bad weapon type, although they're very situational, and other than the Monarch, I just don't find a lot of situations where I need it. When it comes down to the Monarch, obviously it's a very powerful option, especially in something like Trials, where you're working very closely with your team. You fire off a shot, your teammate follows up with their shot, and you kill somebody very quickly. We often consider Le Monarque to be a very good balancing of the scales because it allows bad players to actually fight against good players because of that teamwork capability. On top of also that poison hit and being able to see the dot as they travel around, Le Monarque is just a good option if you get used to it. Beyond that, the legendary options are usually up to you. I personally prefer more towards the lightweights, and a big honorable mention to Whistler's Whim that has gut shot, which allows it to 2-shot body shot, I believe. In the next major category, we have the hand cannons, which seems very odd to be talking about this early because the best rank they have is 6 and 8 and 9. That being said, I still think hand cannons are a good option, especially if you get used to them, but they're definitely a higher skill floor, higher skill ceiling exotic. The main reasons why somebody would use a hand cannon, again, it actually handles pretty well in short to mid, even mid-long range. It's excellent at peak shooting, especially the slower ones like 140s and 120s, going in and out of cover. And obviously very satisfying to you. You get those three-shot headshot kills with 140s, and it feels really good. However, in the current meta, with the in-air accuracy changes, hand cannons have been used a lot less often since they're much more of aggressive weapons, and obviously abilities have gotten a lot better, so it's much more of a defensive meta, waiting for your abilities using pulse rifles. That being said, my personal favorites when it comes to hand cannons is going to be a lot of the 140s. And of these 140s, a lot of them stick out as the S tier hand cannons. Things like Ace of Spades, Hawkmoon, Thorn, a lot of the legendaries, Owlstringer, Fatebringer, Ice Luna, Exalted Truth that came out I think this season, and Palindrome. We obviously have some other ones which are not as S tier but are still decent options, obviously ranked as number 8, including Sunshot, which is somewhat different but still a good option used for the same purpose. And again, I say this pretty much every time, but a well-rolled hand cannon will feel much better than a poorly rolled hand cannon. So if you've not liked hand cannons in the past, it could be that the roll just wasn't right, which is why I often focus on a lot of these because they have stat advantages and oftentimes a lot of really great perks. Something like, for example, Owlstringer, which is a craftable version, can get a very good version, and I would recommend it. Beyond that, I would also recommend something like Last Word and Crimson. Both are really fun to use. Personally, as a controller user, I really like Last Word, and Crimson's also a really good controller weapon as well. Following that, let's take a look at these submachine guns, which are still doing really well in the meta, although obviously not as good as a lot of these sidearms, are still really good options. And I believe last season we had the lightweights as the top of the game. However, this season we found that certain aggressive frames, like a Kellis SMG, are just doing really well, especially as a craftable version. Beyond that, the lightweight 900s are also still doing really well. We have craftable Submission and Callus, which are really nice to see, and a lot of the other aggressives are also doing really well as well. Keeping in mind, certain exotics are really nice. Things like Teraba and Huckleberry are absolutely shredding it in the Crucible. However, others are not really as much. Something like the Manicore that came out this season just really feels slow. You hang in the air, and the bonus doesn't seem worth it. And a little weird thing here is that we have Shire's Wrath kind of clumped in at 5B because it has a very good stat advantage and great perks if you can get it, although it's locked behind Trials of Osiris and precision frames aren't what they used to be. Following that, let's take a look at these sidearms. In my opinion, probably going to be a better option than submachine guns most of the time, although not all of the time. And for the most part, they have a lot of rank 4 options. And this one is going to be a weird section because oftentimes I do group sections like all of the adaptive single shots or all of the adaptive 3 bursts are going to be ranked. In this instance, we've actually found a lot of these options function very similar to each other, even though they have very different frames. For example, we have a bunch of exotics like Rat King, Traveler's Chosen, Devil's Rune with the laser thing is really nice to see. Trespasser has a ridiculous damage output. But we also have a lot of legendary options. We have the single shot adaptives like Ally Demand, Drang, even after its zoom nerf, still doing really well, especially on controller. We also like the 2 burst aggressives like the new Luminal Vigil, and of course Empirical and Forgiveness, still doing really well. And of course, if you have one, Peace Bond, but obviously it's not in the current rotation. And to be honest, you could do decently well with a lot of the other options. These are just the ones that we've found really rise above and beyond. After that, let's take a look at the Pulse Rifle, which technically would be the second best category, but honestly will be the most common sets of weapons that you'll see in the Crucible. Pulse Rifles are everywhere. We are in currently a Pulse Rifle defensive and ability-based meta, and they fit perfectly. And when it comes down to Pulse Rifles, it has been true since it came out, and probably will continue to be true as long as 340s are good. No Time to Explain is the best Pulse Rifle in the game. Firstly, it has exotic tier stats, specifically handling, a lot better handling than the other 340s, on top of the extra damage perk, on top of getting your magazine back, on top of a really good sight. No Time to Explain is an excellent PvP weapon. It may end up being better than DMT for you, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. After that, obviously we have all of the 340 high impact frames. Ever since their numerous different buffs, it allows them to get much more consistent 2 burst kills, and with a damage perk makes it very easy. Our personal favorites are obviously going to be things like New Purpose and Messenger, are excellent sets of stats and perks. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of great energy options. You could get a decent start in Shadows, but the huge saturated pool does make that difficult. And beyond that, at 3A as well, Revision 0, although it looks a little bit odder than the spreadsheet because of the API is still down, I can't copy and paste and see the information over there. Revision 0 with the aggressive 4-burst or that weird 2-burst style is still doing really well in the Crucible. Obviously, it just came out. Obviously, we still have to unlock like 3 different catalysts for it, but it feels really great in the Crucible. We recommend it. Beyond that, we have a kind of, again, weird smorgasbord of options. We usually don't do this, but we've got certain adaptives like Syncopation, Forges, and Yesteryear. We have some exotics like Bad Juju and Outbreak, which are more of like the lightweight frame, including BXR, which is a weird hipfire kind of version. And on top of that, we also have the Vigilance Wing. And then these are all very different kinds of weapons, but they all function very nicely. The main difference is the adaptive frames seem to be a bit more consistent, definitely handle really well at range, and the lightweights are just a little bit faster, not only in your movement and your time to kill, but do lack a little bit of range. And the last thing I'll say about pulse rifles is that the rapid fires were doing incredibly well last season, and ever since the nerf, specifically Pieces of Mind losing zoom, which doesn't seem like it's important, but is incredibly important. That being said, I still like the rapid fires, and you can still do pretty well with them. They just didn't fit in the top 10. And finally, at number 1, we have the DMT, the king that stands on its own, that went from number 1 2 seasons ago to not being on the top 10 after the nerf to being back to number 1 after the buff. And on top of that, we got Long Arm, which is kind of a legendary version of DMT for the energy slot, but even if you build it very specifically for hipfire, you know, hipfire grip, much better accuracy, no aim down sight stuff, it's nowhere near where DMT is. DMT's aim assistance that automatically locks onto the head a lot more often now is just kind of out of this world, and yes, it does need a little bit of a nerf. As somebody who's a controller player, obviously we don't like to blind fire. It does feel somewhat comfortable, especially if we have the catalyst. If you don't have the catalyst, it's probably not worth using, but with the catalyst, it's so much different. And the fact that you can blind fire, get kills at long range with this weapon and still be comfortable at close range, getting very good time to kill, is really strong. And again, the peak shooting, being able to go in and out of cover, it's like the best of a lot of worlds. Beyond that, for the legendaries, we really like the rapid fire frames. These were close to getting the top 10, but just missed the mark. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. And if you see a question that you know the answer to, make sure you help out. And of course, a big shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Without them, videos and spreadsheets would really not be possible. Specifically, big shout out to Mom, Dad, Kipishal, Rob Share, Monday, Background, Student Panther, Case Reagan, and Marcus Silver for their support on Patreon. And that's it. Hope you guys did enjoy. My name is Dychronic, and I'll see you guys on the next one.